Ever stared at your bank account at 3 a.m. and wondered if the universe is playing some cosmic joke on you? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into a reality where the joke becomes literal, and it involves tiny pink creatures with shark teeth and an inexplicable hatred for capitalism. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow, and every billionaire, every Fortune 500 CEO, every hedge fund manager has simply vanished. Not dead, not retired to the Bahamas, abducted. By what, you ask? By Labubu. Yes, those adorable, slightly terrifying collectible toys that your Gen Z cousin obsesses over. Except they're real, they're organized, and they have a very specific agenda. Now, before you roll your eyes and click away, consider this. What if I told you that this absurd scenario could reveal more about human nature, economic systems, and the meaning of existence than any philosophy textbook ever written? What if the collapse of capitalism through alien toy intervention was exactly the existential crisis our species needed? See, here's the thing about hypothetical scenarios. They're mirrors. They don't just show us what could happen. They reveal what we secretly hope would happen. And deep down, haven't you ever wondered what the world would look like if the puppet masters suddenly had their strings cut? If the people who control 90% of the world's wealth just disappeared into the ether, leaving the rest of us to figure out what comes next? This isn't just a story about pink monsters with questionable fashion sense. It's about power, purpose, and whether human civilization can survive without its most controversial architects. It's about discovering that sometimes the most profound questions come wrapped in the most ridiculous packages. So here's what we're going to explore together. And I say together because this journey is going to make us all question everything we thought we knew about society, economy, and our place in this weird cosmic theater we call reality. We're going to witness the most unlikely revolution in human history. One perpetrated by creatures that look like they were designed by someone who fell asleep watching both Pixar movies and nature documentaries about deep-sea predators. Ready to have your worldview gently dismantled by fictional toy monsters? Good, because once we start this journey, there's no going back to pretending that our current system makes any more sense than interdimensional Labubu socialism. It started on a Tuesday, because of course it did. Tuesdays are cosmically designed for weird shit to happen. While the world was busy arguing about coffee prices and quarterly earnings, something far more interesting was brewing in dimensions we didn't even know existed. The first disappearance happened at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Jeff Bezos, mid-dream about converting the moon into a giant Amazon warehouse, simply wasn't anymore. One moment he was there, the next, a Jeff-shaped absence in his $165 million Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by what witnesses later described as the faint smell of bubblegum and existential dread. But here's where it gets really weird. The security cameras, they caught everything. And by everything, I mean footage that would make Christopher Nolan weep with envy. Dozens of pink, big-eyed creatures materiating from what can only be described as cartoon physics made manifest, surrounding sleeping billionaires like the world's most adorable SWAT team. These weren't your garden-variety toys, though. These Labubu moved with purpose, intelligence, and what behavioral scientists would later classify as advanced tactical kawaii deployment. They worked in perfect synchronization, their shark-like teeth gleaming in the darkness as they opened portals that looked suspiciously like the kind of rainbow vortexes you'd find in a children's TV show about friendship and magic. Within 48 hours, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Elon Musk, gone, mid-tweet about colonizing Mars with cryptocurrency. Warren Buffett vanished from his Omaha home, leaving behind only a half-eaten hamburger and a note that said, "Finally, a negotiation I can't win." Bill Gates disappeared while reading a book about malaria prevention, which was honestly kind of tragic timing. The global response was, well, imagine if reality itself had a nervous breakdown and you'll get close. Stock markets crashed harder than a Windows 98 computer running modern software. CNN ran a 24-hour special titled, "Are We Living in a Pixar Movie?" Fox News blamed immigrants. The BBC maintained their characteristic calm while internally screaming. But here's what nobody expected. And this is where our story really begins. The world didn't end. In fact, something far more interesting happened. something that made philosophers pace their offices at midnight and economists question their life choices. Without their overlords, the systems didn't collapse. They transformed. Amazon's warehouses, suddenly free from the mandate of impossible efficiency and worker exploitation, became functional. Employees started taking actual lunch breaks. They formed committees. They painted murals on the walls. Productivity dropped by 15%, but worker satisfaction increased by 300%, which confused the hell out of business school professors worldwide. Tesla's factories, no longer bound by the whims of a man-child with a god complex, began producing actual, reliable vehicles. The engineers, finally free to implement the safety features they'd been secretly designing for years, created cars that could park themselves without spontaneously combusting. Revolutionary stuff. Meanwhile, in their crystal-clear interdimensional prisons, which looked suspiciously like those plastic containers you buy toys in, just infinitely larger, the captured capitalists were experiencing their own transformation. They couldn't check their stock portfolios. They couldn't fire anyone. They couldn't even access their Twitter accounts to post cryptic messages about disrupting things. All they could do was exist. And for people whose entire identity revolved around accumulation and control, this was the equivalent of cosmic waterboarding. But the Labubu weren't cruel. They provided everything their prisoners needed: food, water, shelter, entertainment. They just removed the one thing these individuals valued most: the ability to exploit others for profit. It was rehabilitation through enforced mindfulness, therapy through sensory deprivation of capitalism. As the first week passed, humanity began to realize something profound. Nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. But human society throws a party when the vacuum cleaner breaks, then spends 3 months arguing about who should buy a new one. The absence of the ultra-wealthy created what sociologists would later term the Great Bewilderment, a collective state where 7 billion people simultaneously realized they had no idea how their own civilization actually worked. It was like discovering that your house had been held together entirely by one person's willpower, and now that person was gone. Everyone was just staring at the walls hoping they wouldn't collapse. Governments panicked first, naturally. They'd spent decades crafting policies around the assumption that billionaires were some kind of essential economic nutrients, like vitamins, but for money. Without them, what was the point of tax breaks for the ultra-rich? What was the purpose of bailout packages? Suddenly, politicians found themselves in the bizarre position of having to govern for everyone else. The Federal Reserve called an emergency meeting that lasted 72 hours straight. Ben Bernanke was brought out of retirement to stare at charts that no longer made sense. Janet Yellen was photographed at 2 a.m. outside a 7-Eleven, buying energy drinks and muttering something about paradigm shifts and post-capitalist monetary theory. But while the experts had collective nervous breakdowns, something beautiful started happening at ground level. Something that made anthropologists weep with joy and business schools consider changing their curricula entirely. People started cooperating, not because they had to, not because some authority figure told them to, but because, and here's the kicker, it was actually more efficient than competition. Who knew? Take the supply chain crisis that everyone expected. With major corporation leaders gone, the prediction was chaos. Empty shelves, broken logistics, civilizational collapse within weeks. Instead, something remarkable happened. The workers who actually knew how these systems functioned, the ones who'd been ignored in boardrooms for decades, simply kept working, but they did it differently. Truck drivers started coordinating directly with warehouse workers instead of through 17 layers of middle management. Store employees began ordering based on actual customer needs rather than algorithmic predictions designed to maximize profit margins. Farmers started selling directly to communities instead of through conglomerates that took 80% of the profits. The result? Food became cheaper and more accessible. Supply chains became more resilient. Customer service actually became service-oriented. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. Meanwhile, the tech sector experienced what could only be described as the great debugging of humanity. Without pressure to prioritize growth over functionality, programmers worldwide entered a collective state of zen. They fixed the bugs they've been told to ignore. They removed the features designed to addict users. They created software that actually worked for people instead of against them. Social media platforms, no longer beholden to engagement-maximizing algorithms, became social again. People started having conversations instead of screaming matches. The internet began to resemble its original promise, a tool for connecting humanity rather than dividing it. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Without the constant reminder that a tiny percentage of humans hoarded more resources than small countries, people stopped feeling like failures for being normal. The anxiety that permeated modern life, that sense that you were falling behind in some race you never signed up for, began to dissipate. Children stopped asking their parents why some people lived in mansions while others lived in cars. Not because the inequality had disappeared overnight, but because the most egregious examples of that inequality were currently learning mindfulness techniques in interdimensional timeout. Of course, not everything was sunshine and cooperative agriculture. The absence of major capital created its own problems. Investment in large-scale projects slowed. Some innovations that required massive funding stalled. The space race practically stopped, though many argued this was actually a good thing since most of it had devolved into billionaire penis-measuring contests anyway. Some communities struggled more than others. Places that had been economically dependent on the whims of individual ultra-wealthy people faced uncertainty. Company towns built around single corporations found themselves needing to reinvent their entire identities. But here's what surprised everyone. They adapted faster than anyone predicted. Humans, it turns out, are remarkably resilient when they're not being artificially constrained by systems designed to concentrate power. Local currencies emerged. Barter networks expanded. Community gardens proliferated. People remembered skills their grandparents had taken for granted. How to fix things instead of throwing them away. How to cook from scratch. How to depend on neighbors instead of algorithms. The Labubu, watching from their interdimensional observation posts, seemed pleased. Their big eyes blinked in what researchers interpreted as approval. They hadn't destroyed capitalism to create chaos. They'd removed it to reveal what was underneath. But every revolution has its growing pains, and the third week brought challenges nobody had anticipated. By week 3, humanity was experiencing what psychologists term post-capitalism stress disorder, a condition characterized by the inability to complain about billionaires because they were all in interdimensional timeout, leading to a dangerous buildup of unused outrage. The symptoms were everywhere. Twitter users, deprived of their daily dose of wealth inequality rage fuel, started getting angry about increasingly minor things. Can you believe this guy put pineapple on pizza? This is literally worse than... Wait, what are we supposed to be mad about now? But beneath the surface confusion, something far more interesting was happening. Humanity was undergoing forced evolution. And like all evolution, it was messy, chaotic, and occasionally involved people making really questionable decisions about resource allocation. The first major schism emerged in what historians would later call the Great Ideological Sorting. Without the unifying force of shared economic oppression, people began to organize around different visions of what post-capitalist society should look like. The neo-cooperatives emerged first, led by former middle management types who channeled their organizational energy into creating elaborate systems of democratic resource distribution. They held meetings about meetings, created committees to oversee committees, and developed 47-step processes for deciding what flavor of coffee to stock in community centers. They meant well, but watching them try to democratically choose a pizza topping could take up to 6 hours and 3 subcommittee reviews. Then came the practical anarchists, mostly warehouse workers, truck drivers, and people who actually knew how to fix things. They organized along simple principles. If it's broken, fix it. If someone's hungry, feed them. If something needs doing, do it. They had no time for neo-cooperative committee structures, which led to the first post-capitalist turf wars. Polite, well-intentioned conflicts over whether decisions should be made by consensus or by whoever showed up with tools. The technological optimists believed the solution lay in AI and automation. Without billionaires hoarding advanced technology, they argued, humanity could finally create a post-scarcity society where robots did all the work and humans pursued art, philosophy, and increasingly elaborate forms of caffeinated beverages. They weren't wrong, but they underestimated how much people actually enjoyed having purposes beyond contemplating existence while sipping artisanal kombucha. Meanwhile, the localist purists rejected all large-scale organization entirely. They formed intentional communities that grew their own food, made their own clothes, and treated any technology more complex than a hand loom with deep suspicion. They were happy, healthy, and completely insufferable at dinner parties where they would inevitably explain why store-bought tomatoes were destroying the fabric of reality. But the most interesting group was the chaos surfers, people who embraced the uncertainty as a feature, not a bug. They moved between communities, learned different skills, and treated the collapse of traditional economic structures like the world's largest improvisational theater experiment. They were annoying in the way that genuinely free people often are, but they were also the connective tissue that prevented the different factions from completely isolating themselves. The Labubu observed these developments with what xenosociologists interpreted as bemused satisfaction. They began releasing periodic progress reports, mysterious symbols that appeared on walls, in cloud formations, and occasionally in people's morning coffee foam. When decoded, these messages roughly translated to, "Humans are weird, but they're figuring it out." The captured capitalists, meanwhile, were experiencing their own evolution. Deprived of the dopamine hit of stock prices and acquisition deals, they began displaying behavior that their therapists, yes, the Labubu provided therapy, described as profound psychological restructuring. Elon Musk started actually reading the scientific papers he used to skim for Twitter soundbites. Jeff Bezos discovered that he enjoyed crafting things with his hands, small wooden sculptures that served no profit-generating purpose whatsoever. Warren Buffett found himself writing poetry about the sunset, which was either deeply moving or evidence that interdimensional imprisonment causes brain damage. The jury was still out, but the real transformation was happening in the global economy's immune system. Markets, deprived of their traditional manipulators, began operating in ways that actual economic theory suggested they should. Supply and demand reached equilibrium without algorithmic manipulation. Prices reflected actual value rather than speculative bubbles. Competition occurred between products and services rather than between different methods of exploiting workers. It was so functional that economics professors worldwide questioned whether they'd been teaching fiction for decades. Small businesses flourished without having to compete against companies that could operate at a loss indefinitely thanks to investor capital. Innovation accelerated as inventors no longer had to navigate patent trolls and corporate acquisition strategies. Art and culture exploded as people discovered they had time and energy for creative pursuits when they weren't working multiple jobs to afford basic survival. The environmental impact was staggering. Without the pressure for infinite growth on a finite planet, resource consumption stabilized. Companies focused on durability rather than planned obsolescence. The circular economy that environmentalists have been advocating for decades emerged naturally when businesses weren't pressured to maximize quarterly profits at all costs. But perhaps the most profound change was in education. Schools, no longer pressured to produce workers for an exploitative system, began focusing on what humans actually needed to know: critical thinking, emotional intelligence, practical skills, and the kind of broad knowledge that makes life interesting rather than just economically productive. Children who had been taught that their worth was measured by their potential future earning capacity began exploring subjects because they were curious. Imagine that. Yet challenges remained. Global coordination became more difficult without centralized financial power structures. Some regions struggled with resource allocation. International trade required new frameworks that nobody had quite figured out yet. And then there were the holdouts, people so psychologically invested in the old system that they couldn't adapt. They formed capitalist resistance cells, meeting in secret to trade stocks that no longer had meaning and practiced business jargon that no longer impressed anyone. They were mostly harmless, but deeply sad. By month 2, patterns were emerging that would reshape human civilization forever. 2 months into the Great Labubu Liberation, as historians would later call it, humanity had stumbled into something unprecedented: a functional society. Not perfect, not utopian, just functional. which was so shocking that the UN called an emergency session to figure out what the hell they were supposed to do now that global problems were actually getting solved. The transformation was most visible in cities. Without real estate speculation and algorithmic rent optimization, housing became affordable. This caused such cognitive dissonance among urban planners that many had to take sabbaticals to process the concept of cities designed for people rather than profit margins. In New York, community gardens had sprouted in formerly vacant lots that had been held empty for tax purposes. San Francisco's homeless population had found stable housing through cooperative initiatives that worked because they weren't undermined by tech moguls treating human displacement as an acceptable externality of disruption. But the real revelation was in human behavior. Without the constant pressure of artificial scarcity, the fear that there wasn't enough to go around because a few people were hoarding most of it, people became generous. Sharing became normal. Helping became default behavior rather than exceptional virtue. Psychologists called it post-scarcity personality emergence and wrote papers about how human nature might not be inherently selfish after all. Maybe greed wasn't good. Maybe competition wasn't the only way to organize society. Maybe the entire philosophical foundation of modern economics was built on a false premise. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. The Labubu, sensing that their experiment was reaching a crucial phase, began the next stage of their plan. The captured capitalists started receiving enrichment activities, forced exposure to the communities their former businesses had impacted. They were shown films of their employees' lives, given books written by gig workers, and required to participate in group discussions about the human cost of their decisions. It was therapy through radical empathy, rehabilitation through mandatory perspective taking. Some resisted, others broke down. A few, and this surprised everyone, began to show signs of genuine remorse and understanding. Meanwhile, their former companies continued to evolve. Amazon had become a genuinely cooperative endeavor, with worker councils making decisions about everything from workplace safety to profit distribution. Tesla had pivoted to producing affordable electric vehicles and public transportation infrastructure instead of luxury toys for the wealthy. But the most interesting development was in the financial sector. Without the ultra-wealthy to serve, banks began focusing on their original purpose, facilitating commerce and investment for normal people. Credit became accessible. Loans were made based on ability to repay rather than ability to generate speculative profits. The concept of too big to fail became literally impossible because no single entity controlled enough resources to threaten the entire system. This didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without conflict. The transition created winners and losers, though the distribution was far more equitable than before. Some people who had built their identities around conspicuous consumption struggled with a world where status wasn't measured by the ability to waste resources. Some communities that had depended on exploitative industries had to reinvent their economies entirely. But the adaptation was faster and more comprehensive than anyone had predicted. Humans, it turned out, were remarkably good at cooperation when competition wasn't artificially enforced through resource manipulation. Education systems began producing citizens rather than workers. Healthcare focused on keeping people healthy rather than maximizing billing opportunities. Science and technology advanced rapidly once researchers weren't constrained by profit considerations and patent portfolios. The space program, surprisingly, accelerated. Without billionaires treating rocket ships as personal toys, global cooperation on space exploration became possible. The first truly international Mars mission launched 6 months after the Great Abduction, crewed by astronauts from 12 different countries working together instead of competing for bragging rights. Art and culture flourished in ways that made the Renaissance look like a modest uptick in creativity. When people didn't have to spend most of their waking hours generating profit for others, they discovered they had time for music, literature, philosophy, and increasingly sophisticated forms of fermented beverages. The internet evolved into something resembling its original vision, a tool for sharing knowledge and connecting communities rather than harvesting personal data for targeted advertising. Social media platforms became social again, focused on actual human interaction rather than engagement optimization. But perhaps the most profound change was in how humans related to time. Without the pressure of artificial urgency, the constant sense that you were falling behind in a rigged race. People discovered the concept of leisure, not the desperate collapse of exhaustion that had passed for relaxation in the old system, but actual leisure, time spent pursuing interests, building relationships, contemplating existence, and perfecting various forms of bread making. The Labubu monitored all of this with what observers described as satisfied parental pride. Their interdimensional surveillance showed a species learning to live within its means, developing sustainable systems, and discovering forms of fulfillment that didn't require the suffering of others. But every experiment must eventually face its ultimate test. 6 months after the Great Abduction, the Labubu faced a decision that would determine the future of human civilization: what to do with their prisoners. The captured capitalists had undergone profound changes. Months of forced introspection, mandatory empathy training, and complete disconnection from systems of exploitation had produced results that even their Labubu therapists found surprising. Some had experienced genuine psychological transformation. Others had learned to fake it convincingly. A few had become so institutionalized that the prospect of release terrified them more than captivity. But the real question wasn't whether the prisoners had changed. It was whether humanity was ready for their return. The debate raged across the transformed world. The neo-cooperatives held countless committee meetings about prisoner rehabilitation and social reintegration. The practical anarchists argued for permanent exile. The technological optimists proposed monitoring chips and behavioral modification software. The localist purists suggested ritual purification ceremonies involving organic vegetables and hand-woven accountability blankets. Meanwhile, the chaos surfers threw a party to celebrate the fact that nobody could predict what would happen next. The Labubu's decision, when it came, was typically enigmatic. They announced it through their usual method: mysterious symbols that appeared simultaneously on every smartphone, computer screen, and coffee foam in the world. The message, once decoded, was simple: democracy. You choose. And with that, they initiated the most comprehensive global referendum in human history. Every person on Earth would vote on 3 options: permanent exile, conditional release, or full restoration of the former system. The campaign period was unlike anything in political history. There were no attack ads because the candidates were in interdimensional prison. There were no corporate donations because the corporations had become worker cooperatives. There were no billionaire-funded think tanks because the billionaires were currently learning pottery and discussing their feelings about childhood trauma. Instead, the debate focused on fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the kind of world people wanted to live in. Philosophers found themselves in the bizarre position of having their ideas taken seriously by mainstream media. Economists had to confront the fact that their theoretical models had been contradicted by 6 months of actual reality. The arguments for permanent exile were compelling. Humanity had proven it could function without extreme wealth concentration. Systems had become more efficient, more equitable, and more sustainable. Why risk returning to a model that had created so many problems? The arguments for conditional release were nuanced. Some of the former capitalists had genuinely changed and might contribute positively to the new systems. Complete exclusion contradicted the cooperative principles the world was learning to embrace. Plus, the Labubu's rehabilitation program seemed to be working. The arguments for full restoration were, well, they existed, mostly from the capitalist resistance cells who missed the days when they could fantasize about becoming billionaires themselves, despite statistical odds that made winning the lottery look probable. But as the campaign progressed, a fourth option emerged from an unexpected source: the prisoners themselves. Led by a genuinely transformed Warren Buffett, his poetry had apparently triggered some kind of philosophical awakening. They proposed a radical alternative: voluntary integration into the new systems with permanent wealth caps and mandatory community service. We've learned, Buffett's message read, that accumulating resources beyond any reasonable need isn't just harmful to others, it's harmful to ourselves. We'd like to try being human again. The global response was complicated. Some saw it as genuine growth. Others suspected manipulation. Most people were just confused about how to process the idea of billionaires voluntarily choosing to not be billionaires. The Labubu, watching humanity grapple with questions of justice, forgiveness, and social organization, seemed pleased. They'd achieved something unprecedented. They'd forced an entire species to consciously choose its own social system instead of just accepting inherited structures. The vote, when it came, was closer than anyone expected. Conditional release won by a narrow margin, but with strict conditions: wealth caps, mandatory transparency, community oversight, and regular empathy maintenance sessions with Labubu counselors. More importantly, the process had established something new: mechanisms for global democratic decision-making about fundamental social questions. The referendum had required developing systems for inclusive participation, transparent debate, and binding collective choices that transcended national boundaries. And so, humanity entered its next phase of evolution. The Labubu released their prisoners on a Tuesday, because, as we've established, Tuesdays are when weird stuff happens. But the world they returned to wasn't the one they'd left. The systems had evolved, the people had changed, and perhaps most importantly, humanity had discovered something profound. We're actually pretty good at taking care of each other when we're not artificially prevented from doing so. The former billionaires integrated into their new reality with varying degrees of success. Some became valuable contributors to cooperative enterprises. Others struggled with the transition from absolute power to collaborative participation. A few couldn't adapt and became sad fixtures in coffee shops, telling anyone who'd listen about the good old days when people respected wealth accumulation. But the real transformation was in human consciousness. People had experienced 6 months of what cooperation could accomplish, and they weren't willing to go back to artificial scarcity and engineered competition. The systems that emerged weren't perfect. They were human, which meant messy, imperfect, and constantly evolving. Yet they worked. They were resilient. They were sustainable. And most importantly, they allowed humans to flourish instead of merely survive. The Labubu, their experiment complete, faded back into whatever dimension produces adorable creatures with shark teeth and strong opinions about economic systems. They left behind only their symbols, appearing occasionally in coffee foam and cloud formations, serving as reminders that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected sources. And humanity? We learned to laugh at ourselves, to question our assumptions, and to remember that the systems we create should serve us, not the other way around. We discovered that cooperation isn't just possible, it's often more efficient than competition. We found out that sharing abundance is more fulfilling than hoarding scarcity. Most importantly, we learned that sometimes it takes pink monsters with existential agendas to help us remember what it means to be human. So the next time you see a Labubu toy, remember, even the most absurd catalysts can trigger the most profound transformations. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what our species needed all along. Now, if you found this journey through interdimensional economics and cooperative evolution as mind-bending as I did, you might want to share it with someone else who needs their worldview gently dismantled by fictional toy monsters. After all, the best revolutions start with conversations, and the best conversations start with someone brave enough to ask, "But what if?"